watching, and greetings from Cork City in Ireland. And as the title suggests, for this talk, I'm going to be taking you through some tips in learning a bit more about your Irish surname history. Now, I guess the first question is, well, what is an Irish surname? And, it's always a complicated question because, of course, you have the more stereotypical Irish surnames that we all have in our family tree. But then you have those Irish ancestors who maybe have a surname that wasn't so typical. And so part of this presentation will just be taking you through some of the, some of the origins for Irish surnames. You have the typical Irish surnames, Murphy, McCarthy, Sullivan, so on and so forth. And of course, my own surname, Ryan, there at the bottom. And there are, depending on how you look at history, whether you define these as typically Irish can be open to interpretation. Now, the thing about Irish surnames is that there is a meaning behind them. And you have a number of very common elements in them. So most of us think of, okay, an Irish surname, it has Mac or Mech in there somewhere. And that actually came from the Irish son of, because that's how Irish surnames began. You say like Mac, say McCarthy would be one of the most common names. So that would have been literally a son of someone with the name of Carty. And then you have an O, something other, so like O'Neill, O'Doherty, something like that. And the O was descendant of. And what that meant was that in certain situations where you had an ancestor who was particularly famous, then that name persisted down the generations, perhaps until got to a point that another descendant branching off that family did something even more famous, and so their name was then adopted. And of course, you have the female variants of that. So again, you don't really see this as much in surnames, but mainly when people are speaking Irish. So Ní is the feminine version of Mock, and then Nick would be the female descendant of, so the female version of O. And then you have some other elements. So those were introduced by the Anglo-Normans, so Fitz, such as Fitzgerald, Fitzwilliam, so on and so forth. And that was, brought in that came from the French and was brought in by the French-speaking Anglo-Normans in the 12th century. And then you also have the Butler, the Barry, etc. And that was another Anglo-Norman surname element. And that just means that they came from a specific region. So, the Barry, they were from the Barra region of Wales. So, you've all of these complicated elements within Irish surnames. The first surnames began to emerge in Ireland around the 10th century. There is a myth that Brian Boru was the first one to adopt. They're saying that's not true. It actually predates him by a number of decades. So O'Clery, the Irish O'Clerig. They were the first recorded Irish surname around 916 AD. And this comes from the, mentioned in some of the annals of Ireland. And so before this, surnames were not hereditary. What would happen is that individuals would take the name of either their father, it would either come, maybe a nose ancestor, or sometimes our surname arose from a nickname that that individual or family received. For example, Sullivan's surname comes from O'Sullivan, which meant sort of, like dark eyes. So perhaps, that family were known for, maybe having slightly darker brown eyes, etc. The dynasty of Brian Boru, who died at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014 AD, their dynasty was very, so successful that several surnames branched off for them. So, O'Brien from his direct descendants. Then you had McNamara and McMahon, Kennedy. They would have come from, his children, grandchildren, great grandchildren. Because and that shows just how successful that dynasty was. Now, as I said, even though the first surnames were created around 916 AD, we do have maps of Ireland going back to the 2nd century AD, created by, Roman and Greek geographers, even though, they themselves would never have visited Ireland, but they would have gotten information from traders who had. And this lists, there are a number of place names and tribal groups, such as the Iverni and Brigantes, who are referenced on the map. And, from these tribal groups, the later dynasties which created Irish surnames sort of emerged. So, for example, the group who dominated Munster, where I live in the southwest of the country, were the Onok. And from the Onok, the McCarthy surname eventually emerged. Of course, there were also then various invasions and settlements which left their own surname legacies. So, you had the Vikings. They first show up, raiding Ireland around 795 AD. They left a lot of coastal settlements. Some of them became, towns and cities such as Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Waterford, Wexford. Then the Anglo-Normans, who were themselves descended from Vikings who settled in the north of France, they came to Ireland in 1170, and they took a lot of land for themselves, intermarried with the native Irish chieftains and kingdoms, and a lot of their, they were nominally loyal to the English crown, although that didn't stop them rebelling every so often and having to be, put down. But their surnames eventually, became seen as Irish as well. And here you have, sort of an example of that early map that I mentioned. As you can tell, they weren't exactly great when it came to accuracy. But I said that's because these geographers never actually been to Ireland or Britain and were just going off second and third hand information that they were given. Now, of course, you had later on, you had plantations of Ireland by, various Tudor monarchs, starting with Henry VIII. Their idea was that, what, maybe if we can deal with these Irish rebellions by sending over more loyal settlers, and it was also a way of rewarding people. Of course, they often failed to tell the settlers that they would have to fight with the native Irish to actually hold on to these lands. And then, of course, later on, Cromwell, there was something similar because part of it was down to religion, but also down to the fact that the Cromwellian wars, afterwards there was a lot of famine, the population in Ireland. Some Irish who had rebelled were forcibly transported to as indentured servants to places like the Caribbean and to the new colonies in the Americas. And they're basically like anyone who was seen as loyal to the proposed and executed Charles I often had their land taken from them, and then this was given to Protestant settlers. And then later on, of course, you had the Williamite Wars in Ireland. Basically, what happened is that the James II came to the throne in England, both because he was a Catholic and because he didn't get on with many of his Protestant subjects. He was forced to abdicate by his daughter and her husband, William of Orange, who was actually Dutch. And William, he fled to France, went to his cousin there, who was here in France, got some troops, tried to reclaim his crown by invading Ireland. Many of the remaining Gaelic lords rose up in support of him. After the war, when William won, many of those who had supported James, again, they lost their lands and they were given to supporters of William. But of course, over time, many of the surnames integrated and became Irish. So I mentioned the Vikings earlier. So what Viking surnames do we have which still survive? And just anyone wondering, this photo was taken in the city of Waterford, where they have the Viking Triangle. And if you're wondering anything about the Vikings, that is one of the main places to go. So you have MacAuliffe, son of Olaf, MacManus, son of Magnus, Doyle, son of the dark or evil foreigner, MacCotter, son of Ossier, MacLachlan, son of Norsemen, and O'Higgin, descendant of Igan. And actually, the current president of Ireland is a Michael D. Higgins. So chances are somewhere deep in his ancestry, he has some Viking ancestors. Then, I mentioned the Anglo-Normans earlier on. So this is from a very famous painting in the National Gallery of Ireland, the Wedding of Strongbow and Aoife. And there are many, many different ways to interpret this painting. So I said, the Anglo-Normans, I think probably more so than the Vikings, left a much bigger kind of legacy in terms of surnames. So you had the Fitzgeralds, the Geraldine dynasty. So they were sons of Gerald. So I think probably one of the most prominent. Fitzmaurice, son of Maurice. Barry, the Barra from the region of Barry, Wales. And of course, Barry is a very common surname here in Cork. Burke, the Berg, descendants of William the Berg. Bustler, the Bustler, very common in around Tipperary and Kilkenny. So actually, this is where that profession of a bustler comes from. They were the ceremonial cupbearer in the royal course. And then Prendergast comes from Prendergast region in Pembrokeshire in Wales. And of course, during the later plantations and conquests from the Tudors onwards, you have other, I guess, more sort of English sounding surnames like Boyle, Ludlow, Haslam, Douglas, Mangan, Rowley, and Tuckey. And interesting, Haslam is a surname that would have been very associated with Quakers. So, it wasn't just a case of, the mean English coming in. They also brought groups like the Quakers with them. Oh, where can you actually search for your surname? So you've, land records, census records, religious records, the National Folklore Collection, and passenger lists. Now, the Down Survey of Ireland, so I talked with the Cromwellian conquest earlier, and the Down Survey of Ireland was created as a result of that. Because when you're taking land off of people and distributing it to the people you like, you of course need to keep track of who is getting what. Also because there would have been disputes over this. There would have been some who may said, "Oh, no, look, I repent my allegiance to the king. I swear loyalty to Parliament, and I promise that I will, not, engage in any rebellious activity again. Can I please hold on to my land?" And then, of course, after Charles II was restored, there were plenty of those who had previously supported Parliament who, did a very abrupt about face as well. So the Down Survey of Ireland is useful, maybe understanding, when did this surname come in to Ireland? The Tide Department books, much later, are another land survey. And I think, some churches still have the practice of tithing, of paying a certain percentage of your earnings to the church. Now, initially, the tithing originates in medieval period, and originally you would have actually been giving goods. But later on, that was changed to an actual, monetary amount. And what would have happened is that basically 10% of your rent was given over by the landlord to the church. And, this was paid to the Church of Ireland because they were the established, but it was paid by everyone, regardless of religion, which, understandably led to a certain amount of resentment. But, the Tide Department books are certainly useful just for, because, they're kind of one of the few sources we have from before the famine. Then later on, of course, you have Griffith's valuation, which was a land survey carried out between 1848 and 1864, determined liability to pay the poor. So basically, surveyors came in, they went county by county, they determined, okay, this is how much this land is good quality. This is how much it should be worth. This is how much the tenants are paying in rent. This is who they are paying rent to. And, if you're sort of above if your land was above a certain value, then that determined whether you should be paying the poor rates. And what is particularly interesting about Griffith's valuation is that it was simply the first. It was the first valuation because valuations continued in Ireland up until the 1970s, and these can be consulted in the valuation office in Dublin. But Griffith's valuation is freely available online, and there are also maps attached to it. Now, if you're using Griffith's valuation, and I'm sure there are probably questions about certain surnames already, then one of the best places to start with it is to go to johngrenham.com. John is often referred to as the godfather of Irish genealogy. Some of you may even have his book on tracing your Irish ancestors. And what you can do is you go to his website. If you enter the surname you're interested in into the search bar, it will pull up a map of how that surname was distributed in Ireland around the mid 1800s. And then you can also, he also has maps for some of the other sources, such as, parish registers, civil records, and the surviving census. And as well as showing you where the surname you typed in can be found, it here also brings up the main variant and also where did that surname originate. So, if the surname you're looking for doesn't show up, that doesn't mean that, it's, not found. Right? This means, okay, maybe you need to try one of the variants. Or perhaps, it only came into Ireland sort of, much later. Now, census records. Now, the first attempted sort of, what we consider official state census was attempted in 1813, but it was just a fiasco. It was kind of instead of having a particular census days, they was kind of a bit too, then it wasn't very well organized, and I don't think any of it even survives. 1821 was the first, I think, we could call it like proper census, and that it was actually, successful. They managed to cover the entire country. But unfortunately, we only have the 1901 and 1911 census are the only full surviving census record. We have some fragments of 1821 to 1851. And when we say fragments, we mean fragments. You only find stuff for like a handful of households. There were no surviving census returns from 1861 to 1891. They were actually, essentially they were destroyed by the government due to partially concerns over privacy and then, bureaucratic oversight. Unlike the UK, there was no Irish census in 1920. Because this is something that we constantly ask, when will the 1921 census for Ireland be available? The reason why there was no Irish census in 1920 was because Ireland was in a state of rebellion at the time, and it would not have been very safe for a numerator to be going door to door asking for details of who was residing in that house at the time. So the first census of the Irish Free State wasn't carried out until 1926. That is due for release in April 2026. And, from kind of, bits and pieces that I've heard, it sounds like they're on track. So you can actually access the surviving census records through National Archives of Ireland website that is freely available. And you just said, you can go into the search bar, just put in a surname and maybe see where does that pop up. And there is a good chance that if that surname was found in that area in 1911, then perhaps it is still there to this day. And for any of you who have an interest in literature, you might, if you look at entry number 9 there on this 1911 census form, you will see an entry for William Butler Yeats, who was a boarder at this residence at the time. Now, religious records are, of course, very important. I mentioned that the first surname, Geary, was found in medieval annals because medieval annals were always like the newspapers of their day. They didn't just record notable events for the church, but also sort of the prominent families in the area, because quite often those families were the patrons of those monasteries. We have very few parish registers going back further than the 1800s. There are some Church of Ireland registers from mid 1600s, but those are kind of one or two from Cork and maybe a handful from Dublin. And then sort of find a lot of gaps in the 1700s. The Catholic Church, excuse me. For the Catholic Church, there are some from the mid 1700s, but those are really only for the Cork and Dublin. Religious records, of course, they will often record baptisms and marriages, and as well as sort of the names of the parents and spouses. It's also worth looking at who the sponsors and witnesses were, because they can be useful clues to tracking down extended family. There are also sacramental records, which are kept for Catholic and Anglican churches, and these were recorded, First Communion, confirmation, and records of conversions. Certain surname spellings might be associated with a particular denomination or religious group. So, for example, you find that a lot of Presbyterians, especially in the northeast, what is now Northern Ireland, would have had Scottish surnames because many of them were originally Scottish surnames. Sometimes when a family converted to the Church of Ireland, they might have changed their, the spelling of their surname slightly just to anglicize it more. And just, obviously, to stand out and not be mistaken for any Catholic families with the same surname in the area. Now, you can look for Catholic registers for free as, registered-nli.ie. Apologies, that was a bit of a typo. They're also available on genealogy and rootsisland.ie. Some parish registers transcripts are on Family Past and Ancestry. For Church of Ireland registers, very few have been digitized, and you would have to check with the Church of Ireland Archives, Church Bible Library, to see what actually survives. And all of these links should be in the attached syllabus. For Northern Ireland, you can actually find some of their church records available through the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. And I would say, any Northern Irish research you're doing, Prony should be your first stop, because they have a lot of great stuff on their website which can help you. Now, National Folklore Collection can seem like an unusual choice, not something you'd normally associate with genealogy. But when they were going out collecting the folklore, they also recorded the surnames of those who were either collectors or you know were informants. And it can actually be sometimes be very useful. And in occasion in the folklore, there might even be a bit of history of certain surnames. So they did folklore from, they haven't just done the Republic of Ireland, they did all across the island. Then of course there is also the schools collection, which is one of my favorite sources. But they had was basically school children in the 1930s went out into their communities. They were given lists of questions to ask. They asked their parents, grandparents, neighbors, and they got so much, just so much fantastic, very fantastic stories. So always useful just to look at what surnames were found in certain areas that are actually a way of collecting this information. And so the surnames are recorded as they were given to the collectors. They didn't try to standardize the spellings, and that can actually be very useful because some surnames variants are local to an area, maybe to a parish or a county, etc. And this is where you'll find the Irish surname index. Now, passenger lists are something which comes up so often in queries. You understand that people want to know what ship did their ancestor emigrate on. Now, unfortunately, there were no passenger lists created between Ireland and Britain because movement between Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom was considered as internal migration for for most of the history when Ireland was under the direct control of Britain. And that can be frustrating. So it means that if you are trying to figure out when an Irish ancestor may have immigrated to the UK, you will have to look to other sources such as census, parish registers, even local directories. For the US, you have, you have passenger lists for, from the opening of Castle Clinton in 1855 to Ellis Island in, from 1892. There were some passenger lists created before this, particularly for the, places like Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago. However, they weren't standardized in the way that later passenger lists were, and they don't always record as much information. So if it's, I've seen some passenger lists for Boston in the mid 1800s, so just in the aftermath of the famine. And while they have a list of names on it, they don't necessarily tell you where in Ireland somebody emigrated from, or they don't group families together, which can be can be difficult. So while there are some early passenger lists, they're nowhere near as detailed. And a very common myth, and something that genealogists are blue in the face from correcting, is that names were not changed at LSI. The clerks, who were processing immigrants, recorded the names as they were written down on the passenger list. Part of the reason why you get such a variation in names is that as in, names in Ireland were not standardized at the time. There can, could sometimes be a lot of local variants, or you're dealing with a population who, by and large, didn't have a lot of literacy. They wrote down their name as it sounded to them. And then, of course, you had some later on who did change names to assimilate further, but that was after the immigration. And then, of course, you have Australian passenger lists were kept from about 1924. I think there are, of course, other lists like convict lists, stuff like that, but they are much earlier. And then you've Canadian passenger lists from about 1865. Although I think there are some uh, other lists for Ontario and Quebec, which may predate that. And then, of course, that image that you see there is the statue of Annie Moore from Cork, who was the first immigrant processed through Ellis Island. She left from Queenstown, now Cove, with her two younger brothers to go stay with their parents who had traveled on ahead. And, uh, you know, the house where she lived, where she was born in Cork City, is still standing. And you can actually view the original baptismal list for Annie in the Catholic Cathedral in Cork City. Now, there are a number of things as well that you need to be aware of with passenger lists, because another common question that comes up is, are there any surviving passenger lists in Ireland? So, unfortunately, passenger lists only list the port of departure and not necessarily the place of origin, at least with some of the earlier passenger lists. So sometimes you may have had someone who was listed as Irish, but left from Liverpool. And then, the difficulty is in determining, well, how long were they in Liverpool for? Were they there for a number of weeks? Were they there for months? Could they have possibly been there even for years? Also, there were no records kept at port of departure. And this is because passenger lists were brought in as a response to basically, I guess, certainly the political climate in the in the place of arrival. So, for example, like the reason why you start to see more passenger lists being created in the 1800s in the United States was because of concerns over increasing immigration. You had various waves of Irish, Polish, Eastern European Jews. You had so many different, all these different groups arriving into the West. There was a bit of a panic. What are we going to do with all these immigrants? How do we keep track of them? And that's why passenger lists became more official, started being introduced. And so you don't see them at the point of departure because the authorities in the point of departure weren't necessarily all that worried about who was leaving. It was only when they started arriving that the port of arrival starts to worry about. But if you do search for surnames on passenger lists, sometimes that will, even on those passenger lists that don't give you much information on where they were actually from, it may still give you some clues. So, for example, names like McCarthy, Sullivan are very much associated with, Cork and Kerry. My own surname, Ryan, really more association with like Tipperary, Limerick, not office. Also, keep an eye out for some passengers who may have used a certain variant when traveling. So, for example, I had one of a Grace's uncle who I knew left for New York in the 1920s. I had searched low through various passenger lists. I could not find him. And it was only when I said search for him under the Heelan surname instead of Highland that that he actually turned up. So just be aware of some of these factors when you are searching for some. I said, there are a lot of really useful resources out there. These should be available in the attached syllabus. So, for example, you have, johngrenham.com. And if you are searching for a surname, that should be your first stop. Because we'll actually we'll pull up quite a lot of information. The Down survey, hosted by Trinity College Dublin. Very if you think your ancestors may have been kind of arrived in as part of the Cromwellian conquest / settlement, or if you think, okay, there's the family story that your ancestors were disinherited during this period, because everyone comes to Ireland wanting to find out where their family castle was. So, the Tide Plotman books, very useful for figuring out where your ancestors may have been prior to the famine. Now, I will warn you, that the version that is hosted, the free version that is up on the National Archives of Ireland website, transcription sometimes has a lot of errors. So if you have an Ancestry subscription, it is also up there, and their transcription is a bit better. Griffith's valuation, depending on which county your ancestors came from, may determine where you can actually find them. But even if, say, your ancestors may have left sort of just immediately after or during the famine, you can actually, you can still look at Griffith's valuation and maybe get an idea of, okay, what other families were in that area, and did the surname persist? Census records, very important, even though we have so few of them surviving. But you may get lucky and may find that the census fragments cover the area where your ancestors are from, and perhaps you can use that to figure out, okay, was there somebody, even with the later census fragments, you can check, did that surname survive in the area afterwards? Then, of course, you obviously have the Irish Surname Index, which makes it as part of the National Folklore Collection. Now, if you are using the RootsTech app, or I think as well, I'm not sure if you can also do it on the website, please make sure to give feedback to this session. You go down to the app to fill out the survey base, and all feedback helps, even if you think that even if you want to give it a 1, but I would ask you very, very nicely, please don't do that. And I think that we have time for some questions.
Hey, great, thank you. Yeah, so we do have some questions that I've been collecting from our session chat. We might not have enough time to answer all of them, and they kind of break into 2 categories. So there's some that are more about process, how do I find these things? And others are asking about specific surnames. So I'll focus on the process ones first. If there's more time, we could get into more of those specific questions. So we have Andrea um, asks, can you offer any information on the surnames Jeffords and Belson? To me, they don't sound typically Irish. I have really struggled with finding my Jeffords ancestors because of this. So how do we deal with surnames that maybe don't sound
Yeah,
quite Irish?
well, I'd say again, start with johngraham.com, because there was, because Ireland was part of UK, there was a lot of movement back and forth. A lot of British people would have settled in Ireland because maybe it was cheaper, or because they were working, they were with the army or in the civil service. So maybe look, could the families have come over as part of that? But definitely, start with johngraham.com, because sometimes you might have a surname that sounds very English, but it turns out that it was actually, it originally been an Irish surname, but then they changed it for whatever reasons.
Thank you. And then kind of along those lines, I'll read Carol Hayden's question. Is it common to have variations in surnames in a family/clan? Example, I have Doherty, but I've seen unrelated families, I think, as Doherty, Dougherty, etc. And then another question
Yeah,
along similar lines is, how do you find variations of surnames?
yeah. Again, that's part of it is because these surnames kind of grew out of the various clans, and I suppose like Doherty, there may have been a common ancestor, like several centuries back. Then you may have also had another group in the area who adopted the surname Doherty as sort of a way of showing their allegiance to that group. So it's there's a lot of Y-DNA research being done on Irish surnames, and so it's still kind of ongoing, figuring out, okay, just how do all of these similar surnames connect to each other. And yeah, and again, with surname variations, there are some great lists out there. I think it was there was a historian by the name of McLysart. Like, was this Eamon McLysart? Sorry, I can't remember the first name, but he essentially wrote the definitive book on Irish surnames based on extensive research that he had done. So if you look for McLysart Irish surnames, you may actually be able to find that, and that'll kind of give you a lot of information. But yeah, just even searching on John Graham's website, brings up kind of a list of common variations.
Great. And here's a question from Laura about passenger lists. So she asks, why do you suppose only the baby and not a 3-year-old that came with their parents from Ireland to US in 1850s is not listed on the passenger list? I know the 3-year-old child survived. So why do we have people missing from lists, I guess?
Oh, that's tricky. That's you would actually you would have to ask someone who is a specialist on passenger list management. It could have just been a bureaucratic oversight. It's again, it is very. Actually, it could even just be down to how the passenger lists were compiled in the 80s.
Okay, great. And then here's from Barbara. My 3 times great grandfather's William Geeland death certificate states his parents were from Scotland, emigrated from Ireland to New York City, and died in New York City. How do I know if the surname Gilliland is an Irish name or originally a Scottish name?
That could actually be quite tricky, because there was because like the northeast area of Northern Ireland is so close to Scotland. There's like from pretty much as early as historical records survive, there's been so much movement between two areas. So sometimes trying to figure out what is an authentically Scottish surname versus what is an authentically Irish surname can be very difficult. The expert on Scottish research is a gentleman by the name of Chris Passon. He's written a number of books on tracing your Scottish ancestry. I would say reach out to Chris, because even though Chris is based in Scotland, he's originally from Northern Ireland, so he specializes in both areas and may be able to give you a better answer to that.
Thank you. So this question, I'll just read it and yeah, we'll go from there.
Yep.
So from Elizabeth, I am trying to find the origins of the surname McMichael. My husband's 4 times great-grandmother was an Isabella McMichael. She appeared in the Cumberland County, Nova Scotia baptism birth records between 1837 and 1941 as the wife of Alexander MacDonald. This lady is a ghost. I have not found her anywhere else in Irish, Scottish, passenger list, Canadian records. There were a couple of McMichael families in this area in the late 1800s, but nothing matching this lady. So the question involves, how do you find the ghosts?
Yeah, ghosts are always tricky. Well, I would recommend you looking at through, say, something like Griffith's valuation. Check out where where are like Michael families concentrated? Because that might give you some clues. It's also worth looking into what group settled in that area, because you had a lot of early Scots-Irish immigration to the US in the period kind of just before and after independence. And of course, they don't always get typically, thought of as Irish, but they might, there may be also some clues there.
Great, thank you. And then Joellen is wondering, were there passenger lists for my Irish ancestors that left Ireland in the 1820s?
It would have depended on where they arrived. So as I said, there would have been like passenger lists kept for some of the major ports like Boston, Philadelphia, etc. If they survived, they should be on Family Search and Ancestry, but they are very fragmented in that period. And I said, they don't always give you a lot of information.
And Jill is asking, is there a difference between Mick, MC, and Mac, MAC, and a surname? My mother's maiden name was McMillan, MC.
No, there isn't really. It came down to, I guess, how people pronounce this. Depending on like kind of the dialects of Irish in their area, which then got carried over into English. So those would have kind of spoken more, kind of would have, I suppose, enunciated the A more, would have kept that in their surname, and then those would have sort of spoke more quickly, might pronounce mock as mac. So they might not have enunciated the A as much. So the mac, so basically, essentially, they are the same surname element. And sometimes you do find, some families who will actually will have both.
Great. And Wendy is asking, what are the best resources for those who immigrated from Ulster to the American colonies before the American Revolution, 1720 to 1776?
There are actually there's a lot of good resources in Northern Ireland. For example, there's the Ulster American Folk Park. They have a lot of resources. There's often a lot of those who were sort of Ulster Scots immigrants went over, sometimes they went over as part of like a church group. So there may be some information, kept there. Excuse me.
Okay. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. So we have Jane saying, I see Prendergast on one of your slides. Did the Prendeville surname also originate from Pembrokeshire, Wales, or Belgium?
Prendeville, that's an interesting one. Prendeville probably would have been another, I don't know what name, but I don't know where is. Because we do have we do have like, we have, Prendeville would be county around Cork as well. I assume they would have been another Anglo-Norman name, but I don't know where exactly they would have come from.
Okay. And we have Pamela asking, a genealogist at Dublin's Epic Museum suggested that my Irish surname may be an English translation or phonetic version of a Gaelic name. Any suggestions on how to figure out the Gaelic version? So the name is Hungaville or Hungerford, both used sometimes by the same individual.
Again, if you search johngraham.com, he usually brings up the Gaelic variants as well. But yet, something like that should be fairly well documented.
Right. We have Carrie. I'm trying to find my link to Ireland on my Mulligan side. I found the O'Rourke's in Carrick on Shannon. The Magners, my great-grandmother, I believe is from Cork, but I haven't found much because I don't know how. Any comments on Mulligan would be so grateful. The little I've gleaned, I'm thinking possibly Northern Ireland, but no trace back.
Yeah, some Northern Irish records can be tricky, especially like kind of the early Scots-Irish settlers. Um, I think maybe look to see, if you can figure out sort of like roughly when your mulligans arrived, which I know is easier said than done, as we've already said when it comes to passenger lists. That might actually give you, some clues, because I said like different, like a lot of the early settlement was Scots Irish from what is now Northern Ireland. And it's only kind of in the 1800s onwards that you start getting more of sort of regular Catholic Irish. But I think Mulligan probably would have been, sounds, as far as I think it is a Northern Irish name.
Okay, great, thank you. So that's all the time that we have. So we'll close up our session here. The recording will be available shortly on the same link, and the handout is available for download as you scroll down beneath the video.